The water is rising, not as a metaphor, not gradually, not in a way that gives anyone time to write it down. Picture a coastal plain 6,000 years before the Common Era, grass running to the horizon, a river cutting through soft limestone. Someone stacks fish near a stone-ringed spring. Someone else is laying a foundation, rectangular, carefully measured, oriented against something in the sky above them. These are not myths. These are people with calluses and debts and bad knees who are building something that will still be standing when the sea takes it. And the sea does take it. Between 14,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era, as the last glaciers collapsed, sea levels across the entire planet rose by more than 120 meters. Coastal plains the combined size of Europe were erased. The populations living on them, building, fishing, mining, organizing, sank with the land. What they left behind is sitting in anaerobic darkness at depths nobody was looking for, until recently. Here is the official narrative. Civilization begins in Mesopotamia, roughly 5,000 years before the Common Era. Cities, irrigation, writing. A clean origin point, the starting line. Here is what the seabed is now telling us. That story is missing chapters. Not one or two, several. 10 sites on 4 continents carry physical evidence. Walls, cities, mines, pyramid cores, stone circles that predate the official timeline by thousands of years. Some were submerged by rising seas. Some were deliberately buried. Some were discovered by oceanographers or divers, and then, quietly, defunded. What connects them is not mythology. It is matter. Radiocarbon-dated organic material, sonar geometry, isotope ratios. Published findings that the standard timeline has spent 50 years finding ways not to discuss. These places exist. The coordinates are real. The arguments about what they mean are what the next 30 minutes are for. 11,000 years ago, on a ridgeline in what is now southeastern Turkey, someone raised a 50-ton carved limestone pillar 12 feet into the air, decorated its surface with high-relief scorpions and foxes and vultures, and placed it inside a precise concentric circle of identical pillars. And then, a few centuries later, someone buried it. This is what makes Göbekli Tepe unlike anything else in the archaeological record. Not its age, though the age alone is enough to destabilize the standard timeline. The complex predates Stonehenge by 7,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 6,000. The German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations from 1995 until his death in 2014, documented firmly enough that the site was built by hunter-gatherers to create a permanent problem for the standard timeline. Not farmers, not city dwellers. People who, according to every existing model of technological development, should not have been able to extract, transport, and erect 50-ton monoliths. The T-shaped pillars of the deepest excavated layer stand up to 5.5 meters tall. Schmidt's team estimated that carving a single pillar required between 300 and 500 person-days of coordinated labor. Georadar surveys have confirmed at least 15 additional enclosures still underground, meaning less than 5% of the site has been studied. The site also carries something that archaeologists have spent years trying to de-emphasize, a botanical detail. The wild einkorn wheat growing near Göbekli Tepe is, according to genetic mapping conducted by Manfred Neef at the German Archaeological Institute, the closest living genetic ancestor to all domesticated wheat on Earth. Every loaf of bread made in the last 10,000 years traces its genetic lineage to a specific strain that grew in the immediate vicinity of this structure. The mainstream explanation is that agriculture emerged near the site because of the good conditions. An alternative reading is that whoever built the complex managed the domestication process deliberately, that Göbekli Tepe was not a product of the agricultural revolution. It may have been its origin point. None of that, however, is the part that refuses to settle. The complex was not abandoned, it was buried. For one of the major enclosures alone, more than 500 cubic meters of fill material was deposited. Broken animal bones, stone fragments, soil, structured layers. Not erosion. Deliberate, organized infill, requiring coordinated effort on the same scale as the original construction. The people who built these circles then spent generations covering them over, creating an artificial hill that looked natural from a distance. The mainstream explanation: ritual closure, a ceremonial ending. The community transitioned to sedentary life and symbolically sealed its older way of being. That explanation works, as long as you don't ask why they needed the structure preserved rather than destroyed. Burning or toppling the pillars would have been faster. They didn't topple them, they protected them. They created conditions for survival across thousands of years, as if they intended someone to find them. No further deep excavation of the buried enclosures has been funded at a scale matching the site's significance. The cause of the burial is classified as cultural ritual. The 15 circles still underground are classified as awaiting future study. The institution responsible for the site budget files its annual report. Officially, there is nothing urgent here. Officially, the fish were stacked. That is what stopped the archaeologists. Under 8 meters of Mediterranean water, off the coast of Haifa, a team led by Ehud Galili, senior researcher at the Israel Antiquities Authority, was mapping a Neolithic village so completely preserved they could reconstruct the last morning of its existence. Atlit Yam went under between 9,000 and 8,300 years before the Common Era. The village covered 40,000 square meters, roughly 6 full football fields. It contained rectangular stone foundation houses, paved courtyards, and wells lined with dry-laid masonry to a depth of 5.5 meters. At the center stood a circle of 7 stones, each weighing 600 kilograms, arranged around what had been a freshwater spring. 7 stones, 600 kilograms each, placed in a deliberate arrangement around a water source by people who were, according to the timeline, early-stage Neolithic communities of limited organizational capacity. Among the 65 human skeletons recovered from the site, the males showed a consistent bone pathology in the ear canal, tympanic thickening, the clinical signature of repeated cold water diving. These men spent their lives submerging in the Mediterranean in winter temperatures, retrieving food from depths their bodies adapted to over generations. They were professional divers, not recreational, professional. And in one area of the excavation, the fish were still arranged in preparation for smoking or drying, positioned in rows, waiting to be finished. The sea didn't give these people a warning. There is no evidence of a planned departure, no emptied storage rooms, no removed valuables. Personal objects remained on surfaces. The settlement was overtaken mid-task. Galili's team proposed a plausible mechanism, a submarine landslide off the slopes of Mount Etna, triggering a localized tsunami event. Whatever the cause, the result was not gradual. One season, these people were working the catch. The next, the site was 12 feet underwater. The first documented case of tuberculosis in the archaeological record was found here. A woman and an infant buried together under a house floor, the standard Neolithic practice of keeping your dead inside the domestic world. Pott's disease had deformed the woman's spine. The infant beside her showed matching skeletal pathology. They had been placed in the house foundation with the same care that characterized every other aspect of this settlement. If a village this complex and this organized existed under 8 meters of water off the Israeli coast, what is resting at 60 meters? At 100? The coastal shelf drops quickly. Atlit Yam is shallow. The sites on deeper shelves, the ones that would represent the larger settlements, the regional centers, the places people traveled to, those would sit at 30, 40, 50 meters. Nobody has systematically looked. The site confirms one thing clearly. Sophisticated communities existed in coastal zones that are now underwater, and Atlit Yam is almost certainly not the exception. It is the only one we happened to find before the sediment covered it completely. It was found by accident. In 2021, researchers from the University of Rostock were conducting a student training exercise in Mecklenburg Bay, a routine multi-beam sonar survey of the Baltic seafloor. The data came back with a linear anomaly 21 meters below the surface, 971 meters long, composed of 1,673 individual stones. 47 of them were boulders too heavy for any person to have carried. The smaller stones had been fitted between them in a way consistent with deliberate assembly. Total displaced material, well over 140 tons. Jacob Geersen, at the Leibniz Institute for Baltic Sea Research, who published the findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, dated the construction to approximately 11,000 years before the Common Era. The sea swallowed it around 8,500 years before the Common Era, when glacial melt erased Doggerland, a landmass that once occupied what is now the shallow North Sea and connected Britain, Denmark, and northern Germany. Doggerland is gone. The wall survived. Geersen's team proposed the most conservative explanation, a hunting structure. Reindeer herds migrating across the tundra plains of Doggerland were reluctant to cross linear obstacles and would have followed the wall's length directly toward waiting hunters. The explanation is ecologically plausible. It is also structurally inadequate. Building a structure that holds visual coherence for nearly a kilometer requires more than an intention to herd animals. The builders navigated around variations in the substrate, changes in sediment density, irregular bedrock, while maintaining the line's continuity, that is, surveying, the kind you apply when you're marking a territory boundary, or a route, or a threshold between two controlled zones. Researchers noted the possibility of a second parallel wall buried under deeper sediment nearby. If that structure exists, the Blinker Wall stops being a hunting funnel and starts being a corridor. Infrastructure, a managed lane across a landscape that no longer exists. 140 tons of stone, organized across nearly a kilometer of open plain, by a population that, according to the standard model, was scattered and mobile. Someone on that drowned land had the organizational capacity to commission a structure that outlasted the land itself. The structure was found in 2021, 21 meters down, during a student training exercise. Not a funded expedition, not a dedicated archaeological survey, a semester assignment. The wall had been waiting there for 11,000 years, and no one had looked for it because the model said it should not exist. Now follow that same coast 8,000 kilometers to the southeast. In 2017, Hugh Thomas, a researcher at the University of Western Australia, finished analyzing satellite imagery of northwestern Saudi Arabia and published a finding that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. More than 450 large rectangular stone structures, distributed across an area the size of Britain, built between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago. They were named mustadils, from the Arabic word for rectangle. The smallest span the length of a city block. The largest stretched 600 meters end to end. At the time of their construction, the Arabian Peninsula was not a desert. It was a savanna. What geologists call the African humid period had transformed the region into a network of freshwater lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Elephants lived in what is now the empty quarter. Hippos swam in rivers that dried up 4,000 years ago. The mustadils were built during this green window, before the desertification that turned the landscape into what you see on satellite maps today. The walls are roughly 1.2 meters high, composed of local sandstone, with a single narrow entrance at one end and a sealed chamber at the other. Inside the chambers, Thomas's team found animal skulls, cattle, gazelle, goat, deposited as offerings. The official classification followed. Ritual enclosures, possibly related to a cattle cult that spread across the Neolithic Middle East during this period. Ceremonial structures, religious use only. Examine the architecture. There are no doorways in the mustadil walls anywhere except that one narrow entrance at the head. The walls reach 1.2 meters. A deer crosses them in a single stride. As livestock enclosures, they are structurally non-functional. As markers readable across a plain, indicating territory, pointing toward resources, signaling ownership, they function exactly as designed. The logistics don't hold. 450 structures, covering 200,000 square kilometers, with walls too low to contain any animal that could be described as a threat. The structures are visible as a coherent distribution only from altitude. They cluster in groups, align in ways suggesting awareness of each other, and are positioned relative to topographic features that would only matter to someone moving large groups of people or animals across long distances. No single tribe in the Neolithic period held territory this large. To build 450 of them across that landscape, someone had to carry instructions across hundreds of kilometers, repeat construction standards between distant groups, and make people who had never met each other build to the same idea. Saudi Arabia restricted foreign archaeological access to these sites for decades. A comprehensive international survey only became possible after 2018. The data accumulated before that point was filed domestically and largely inaccessible. What if these weren't enclosures? What if they were signage, the infrastructure of a civilization watching its own habitat dry up, marking territories that were dissolving, leaving the landscape legible for whoever came through when the water was gone? 600 meters of stone wall doesn't get built for a ceremony. It gets built when someone is standardizing a landscape at continental scale, setting boundaries, recording routes, making the land readable, not for the generation building the wall, but for the generation that would inherit what was left of it. There is a layer in the Black Sea sediment that tells the entire story in 3 centimeters. At a precise depth, the microfossils change. Above the boundary, marine organisms adapted to salt water. Below it, freshwater species. The transition is sharp. No gradual mixing, no extended period of adjustment. One geological moment, salt water replaced fresh water throughout the entire basin. It happened approximately 7,600 years before the Common Era, the moment the Bosporus breached, and the Mediterranean poured into what had been a freshwater lake sitting roughly 150 meters below sea level. The plain that surrounded that lake, 155,000 square kilometers of arable lowland, connecting the Balkans and the Caucasus, flooded in a matter of weeks. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who located the wreck of the Titanic, led expeditions to the Black Sea shelf beginning in 2000. Sonar surveys off the Turkish and Bulgarian coasts at depths of 90 to 150 meters returned regular geometric shapes, rectangles with consistent angles, structures that sediment doesn't spontaneously produce. His team brought up fragments of worked wood from 95 meters below the surface. 2 independent laboratories returned consistent dates, approximately 7,000 years before the Common Era. Buildings, preserved in the anoxic cold of a Dead Sea floor, sealed in a hydrogen sulfide environment where organic material does not decay. The beams were still intact. Below 200 meters in the Black Sea, almost nothing biological decomposes, which means that anything organic that was on that plain when the water came is, in principle, still there. Ballard announced the findings. Mainstream archaeology requested more data before drawing conclusions. The follow-up expedition was never organized at the scale the site demanded. The footage from the submersible passes was not publicly released in full. The 155,000 square kilometers of lowland that went under, unexamined. The people on that plain went somewhere. They carried their memories with them. And in every major ancient tradition that postdates this event, Sumerian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, there is a story of a man warned by a god, a rising water, a catastrophic flood, a civilization reset. That narrative is not found in cultures that predated the Black Sea flood. It appears after it. Consider what that means. The water didn't just drown a landscape. It may have fractured a civilization's continuity so completely that the memory of what existed before was converted into mythology. What survived as a story about gods was once a living person's experience of watching their world disappear under water they couldn't stop. Remember the fish in Atlit Yam, still stacked for drying on the Israeli coast. That is the same rising water, the same era of coastal loss, the same catastrophe, witnessed from 2 different positions on its shrinking edge. Now follow the water east. In 2000, engineers from India's National Institute of Ocean Technology were conducting a routine sediment survey in the Gulf of Khambhat, off the coast of Gujarat, when their acoustic sensors returned anomalies too regular for geology. They sent a camera team into the water. What came back on screen were rectangular foundations, symmetrical platforms, structures measuring approximately 15 meters on a side, aligned along the bed of an ancient river channel at depths between 20 and 40 meters. The channel itself ran 9 kilometers from end to end. The acoustic signature was consistent with planned construction. The team pulled objects from the sediment, semi-precious beads made from chert and jasper, drilled, shaped, polished, pottery fragments, a piece of worked wood. The wood went to 2 independent laboratories, the National Geophysical Research Institute in Hyderabad and the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleosciences. Both returned dates between 7,190 and 7,545 years before the Common Era, 5,000 years older than the Indus Valley Civilization, 5,000 years older than Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, which had been considered the oldest urban culture in South Asia. The implications were immediately contested by traditional archaeologists, who raised a legitimate objection. The wooden piece could have been deposited by river current from an inland site and may not be structural. The objection is worth taking seriously. River systems do deposit organic material far from its origin, but the acoustic geometry of the foundations was not explained by natural processes in the published dispute. Neither were the drilled beads, objects that require tool use, sustained precision, and a reason to produce them in volume. Beads are trade goods. They imply exchange reaching well beyond isolated households, which is exactly why the site deserved a return survey rather than a government classification and 20 years of silence. No underwater excavation of the site has been funded since the initial survey. The National Institute of Ocean Technology acknowledged the findings. Archaeologists noted their skepticism. No international consortium organized a diving season. No submersible survey was commissioned. The acoustic data exists in a government report. The artifact dates exist in a laboratory analysis. The conversation about what to do next lasted approximately 4 years, and then went quiet. The site was given a name, the Gulf of Combat Cultural Complex. And then, officially acknowledged and officially unexamined, it was filed. The foundations stayed where they were, 40 meters down, under the mud of a bay that was a river valley when they were built. 40 meters is a standard recreational dive depth. This is not the deep ocean. The question of why no one has gone back is not one of capability. It is one of priority, and what it says about institutional priorities is not comfortable to sit with. In 1987, a diving instructor named Kihachiro Arataki was exploring an unfamiliar section of reef near Yonaguni-jima, Japan's westernmost inhabited island, when his light caught something that made him stop completely and surface to get more air before going back down. Steps, carved from solid bedrock, rising in a terraced pyramid formation toward a flat summit 30 meters above the seafloor. The Yonaguni Monument is 290 meters long, 120 meters wide, and rises 26 meters from base to crest. Its surfaces include flat terraces with near-vertical faces, stairways with rise and run dimensions consistent with human scale, a circular depression approximately 2 meters in diameter, and a path of flat paving running around the base of the entire structure. The material is Miocene sandstone and mudstone, a layered sedimentary rock that does develop natural fracture patterns. That is the central argument for the structure's natural origin. Masaki Kimura, professor of marine geology at the University of the Ryukyus, spent more than 15 years diving the site. He documented what he identified as tool marks, regular notches and small circular holes, inconsistent with natural fracture propagation. He also found something more consequential: silt deposits containing stalactites. Stalactites form only in air, through calcium carbonate precipitation from dripping water. Their presence inside a submerged formation proves the structure was above the waterline at some point after the sediment in question was deposited. Sea level records confirm Yonaguni was above water more than 10,000 years ago. The Japan Agency for Cultural Affairs has refused to recognize the structure as a cultural heritage site. Under Japanese law, that refusal blocks any government-funded archaeological investigation. The official classification remains: natural geological formation, result of tectonic fracturing and erosion. Robert Schoch, the Boston University geologist, known for his contested redating of the Sphinx's water erosion, visited the site and concluded that natural processes could account for the basic shape. He did not, in his published analysis, address the stalactites, the 2-meter basin, or the 24 geometric elements Kimura cataloged as inconsistent with fracture mechanics. His conclusions stopped at the general form and did not engage the specific anomalies. Where does natural formation end and human intent begin? Erosion can produce a flat terrace. It can produce a vertical face. Natural processes can explain parts of the form at Yonaguni: the general terracing, the broad fracture lines, the planar surfaces. The problem is the concentration: flat terraces, perpendicular walls, consistent step heights scaled to human movement, a circular cut basin, and a perimeter pathway, all in the same rock unit, at the same site, coordinated in the same direction. Any single element, plausibly natural, the full set, in one place, becomes a different kind of argument. Why exactly this one gets a different standard is a question the Japan Agency for Cultural Affairs has not answered publicly. Advanced Digital Communications was hired to search for Spanish colonial shipwrecks off the western tip of Cuba. Sunken galleons. That's the job. They were not looking for anything else. In 2001, their sonar equipment returned images from a depth of approximately 2,300 feet, roughly 700 meters, in the Yucatan Channel. The images showed large, smooth-sided blocks with perpendicular edges, organized in patterns suggesting squares, rectangles, and elevated pyramid formations. The survey area covered approximately 2 square kilometers. The oceanographer Paulina Zalitsky examined the data and described the formations as, her words, from the published interview, very symmetrical and geometric, almost architectural. She compared the general spatial organization to Teotihuacan in central Mexico, a grid-based arrangement with elevated central structures surrounded by lower rectangular formations. The comparison was explicitly not a claim of direct connection. It was a description of structural similarity and layout. The findings were published in 2003. National Geographic expressed interest in a follow-up expedition. Within 12 months, that interest had evaporated without explanation. No major follow-up expedition has been mounted. The final imagery from the original survey was never released for peer review. This is the point where I have to be precise about what is known and what is not. The depth is 700 meters. Global sea level at the end of the last ice age was approximately 120 meters lower than today, meaning that for these structures to have been built when they were above water, using conventional sea level models, they would need to be at least 50,000 years old. No current model of human civilization accommodates that. The alternative explanation is catastrophic tectonic subsidence. The Cuban coast sits along an active fault zone, and significant local subsidence is geologically possible. But subsidence of nearly 600 meters in the time frame required has no documented parallel in regional geology. Geologist Manuel Iturralde Vinén of Cuba's National Museum of Natural History reviewed the sonar data and stated publicly that the formations appeared to be reworked by human hands. He then added that science currently has no explanatory framework for how they could be at that depth. That sentence has been sitting in the record for 22 years. The investigation was closed. The images were not published. The question Iturralde Vinén identified as unanswerable was not reopened. Something at 700 meters generated sonar signatures that two separate researchers independently described as architectural. What it is has not been determined. What is certain is that the process of determining it was stopped before it could reach a conclusion. The depth is the problem that doesn't go away. Global sea level rise since the last ice age accounts for 120 meters. These structures are 580 meters below that threshold. There is no sea level model, no glacier melt scenario, no accepted reconstruction of late Pleistocene oceanography that puts human construction at 700 meters depth. The only available explanations, massive local tectonic subsidence in a geologically short period, or a human presence so ancient it has no other physical trace anywhere on Earth, are both, in their own way, equally difficult for the standard timeline to absorb. Geologist Iturralde Vinén put it plainly. Science currently has no explanatory framework for how they could be at that depth. That sentence has been sitting in the record for 22 years. The images were not published. The investigation was not reopened. The depth remains what it is. Here is the conventional picture of a human being 33,000 years ago, wearing animal hides, carrying a hand-knapped stone tool, following megafauna across a glacial landscape, subsistence, migration, opportunistic survival. That picture has a problem. In Upper Egypt, in the district of Nazlet Khater in the central Nile Valley, archaeologists excavated 16 separate trenches and horizontal galleries cut into limestone bedrock. The galleries branched laterally from vertical access shafts. The roof stone was left deliberately in place at calculated intervals to prevent subsidence, a technique called pillar and stall mining that engineers still use today. The rock walls showed systematic extraction of high-quality flint along specific seam orientations. More than 320 cubic meters of material had been removed. The complex was constructed and actively used between 33,000 and 35,000 years before the Common Era. The engineering principles applied at Nazlet Khater are not conceptually different from those in Neolithic flint mines 7,000 years later, or Roman limestone quarries 30,000 years after that. Shaft access, horizontal gallery extension, structural roof columns, ventilation considerations implied by the gallery geometry. Animal bones, specifically the horns of large bovids, were used as hafted picks, confirmed by microscopic use-wear analysis. This was not opportunistic collection from surface outcrops. This was designed, sustained industrial extraction. Near the complex, excavators found a human skeleton, designated NK2, adult male, cranial volume consistent with modern Homo sapiens, but the lower jaw, the mandible, had proportions that combined archaic and modern morphological features in a configuration that does not match any other specimen in the entire paleoanthropological record from this period. He was buried in a flexed position with grave goods near the entrance to the mine. He appears to have belonged to the operation. He had a face that doesn't fit any category we currently use, and he was mining. The data from Nazlet Khader has never been credibly refuted. It is published, it is cited, and it is systematically absent from every popular account of human prehistory, every school curriculum discussion of the Stone Age, every documentary about the origins of civilization. A 33,000-year-old industrial complex with standardized extraction techniques doesn't fit the linear model of gradual technological development. So the data exists in specialist literature, while the model continues unchanged around it. The knowledge these miners had didn't grow slowly from nothing. It appeared, fully formed, in the rock record, and then it disappeared, only to reappear thousands of years later, in the same region, credited as invention. Something was lost in between. Whatever it was lost completely. The hill in West Java that locals call Gunung Padang, Field of Light, has been considered sacred longer than written Indonesian history reaches. When Dutch geologists catalogued it in the 19th century, they noted terraced stonework at the summit and classified it as a megalithic temple from the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. Standard assessment, filed and largely forgotten. What nobody thought to ask for 100 years. What was inside the hill? In 2012, Danny Hilman Natawijaya, senior geologist at Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency, applied seismic tomography, electrical resistivity analysis, and ground-penetrating radar not to the surface terraces, but to the mass of rock below them. The instruments returned 3 distinct subsurface chambers. The largest measured 15 meters in length. The chamber walls contained what Natawijaya's team identified as an artificial composite: iron, sand, and mineral aggregate packed between basalt column joints, with electromagnetic properties inconsistent with natural geological fill. Someone had made a material and used it to build something inside a mountain. Core drilling reached organic material at progressively deeper layers. Radiocarbon analysis returned dates that forced a complete reevaluation of the site's timeline. The outermost stone layer at the summit, approximately 2,300 years before the Common Era. The second buried construction phase, between 14,000 and 15,000 years before the Common Era. The deepest layer, the original foundation, 40 meters underground, returned dates of 24,000 to 26,000 years before the Common Era. At the peak of the last ice age, when glaciers covered a third of the planet and sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today, someone on the island of Java was constructing the foundation of what would eventually look like a mountain. And then, for 20,000 years, successive populations returned to it. Each found the structure below, added their own layer on top, and left, until the whole accumulation looked natural from the outside. The Indonesian government suspended Natawijaya's excavation permits in 2014. The team was denied further drilling access. The methodological critique from peer review was real and worth taking seriously. Organic material at extreme depth can migrate through sediment, producing dates older than the construction that surrounds it. That concern has never been resolved. Neither has the alternative. The chambers exist, the artificial fill exists, the multi-phase construction history exists. And all of these were confirmed even by researchers who disputed the deepest dates. The criticism addressed the timeline. It did not explain what was built inside the hill, or why. 10 sites, 4 continents, physical matter, carved stone, drowned wood, isotope-dated bone, sonar geometry, that exists in the published record and doesn't fit the model. Acknowledgement, skepticism, underfunding, silence. Not active suppression, a lack of urgency that produces the same result. The questions don't get answered, the model continues unchanged, because nobody formally funds the contradiction. You reviewed an 11,000-year-old wall on the Baltic seafloor. Industrial mines operating 33,000 years before civilization was supposed to exist, and a pyramid core with 3 chambers inside it that the Indonesian government stopped excavating when the dates came back wrong. Not legends, published data, government survey reports. Most people encounter ancient mystery content and take away mysticism. You stayed through the isotope ratios, the sonar geometry, and the skeleton with a jaw that doesn't match anyone in the fossil database. You're already asking the real question, not whether these sites exist, but what revising the timeline around them changes about everything built on top of it. 2 sites from today. Name the one that makes the strongest physical case for organized civilization before the official timeline. Then name the one most likely to be a misread. Defend both with the data. The most coherent argument gets pinned. Subscribe if you want to follow where this goes. Ballard's submersible passed over those wooden beams in 2000. The footage was never fully released. Whatever is preserved in that anoxic dark has been waiting 25 years. That is where this investigation goes next.